Okay, good morning everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you, Eamon, very much for the invitation. I'm a Belfast boy myself, but I'm currently working in Keele University, Staffordshire in England, so it's great to be back over here and to meet with you all today. So we're all talking about loneliness this morning. One of the things I want to talk about is a little bit more, I suppose, more of the philosophy behind loneliness and the experience of that. And if I was to ask everybody in the room, have you ever felt lonely? I think most of us would probably be able to recount a time when we have felt lonely. We'd be able to put our hands up to that. But if I was to ask you to actually articulate and explain what that emotion felt like, that might be a bit trickier. That might be more difficult to actually explain exactly what loneliness is and how that has come about within yourself, okay? And so there are many actual definitions of loneliness. If you're actually to look at academics and how they talk about loneliness, they have a lot of different definitions. But I like Colleen, 1998, who says it's a discrepancy between one's emotional and or social needs and wants and the reality of their social experience. Okay, so in other words, we have a desire to be over here with maybe a group of people or with a particular individual, but actually we're here at the moment. And we feel separate from it. We're cut off from where we actually want to be. And as many of the people have said already, and probably more so to say today, that state could be within a range of different factors. It could be because the person is living alone in their own house. It could also be in a room like this when you're surrounded by people. The experience of loneliness is entirely subjective to each of us as individuals. We can't say that, well, I feel lonely because of this, so that person must feel lonely as well, but actually they might respond in a very different way. It's very important to kind of understand the difference in that. I know we have Alan Bennett coming up in a little bit, and I remember seeing that Talking Heads years ago about the cream cracker under the city, which was a great story. He also wrote a play called Sunset Over the Bay, which was about a couple who were retiring, and they had previously lived in the Leeds-Bradford area of England. And then they moved to a seaside town called Morecambe, which is on the northwest coast of England, if you don't know that. So it's quite a distance from Leeds and Bradford. So basically they upped and left because they wanted to have this idyllic retirement on the seaside, looking out over the sea. Sounds fantastic, but actually what they were doing is that they were separating themselves from everyone that they knew before in the place in Leeds, where they actually grew up and where they had spent their working lives. They separated themselves and they went to this place in Morecambe, and they began to feel a bit unhappy about where they were and being able to fit into this new environment. And what I'm describing there is an example of what we would call social loneliness. And slightly different from emotional loneliness. Emotional loneliness is perhaps the loneliness that we tend to associate with things like bereavement, for example. It's whenever we lose the person that we feel closest to, the person who's the confidant, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be a spouse or a long-term partner. It could be somebody's mother or father, it could be a brother or sister, it could be a very close friend. Emotional loneliness results when we lose that one particular person, or maybe one or two of these particular people, okay? And social loneliness relates to being almost like in an unfamiliar area and not feeling settled, not being happy with the group of friends and acquaintances that we have. So there's slight differences between those two. I also want us to think about another set of subcategories within loneliness. And one of this relates to state loneliness, and then there's chronic or trait loneliness. And what I mean by that is chronic or trait loneliness is loneliness which is developed over a long period of time. So it's somebody who says, I'm lonely, but not only the fact that I'm lonely now, but I've been lonely for a very long time. I've been lonely maybe all my life or all my adult life, or I've been lonely for the last 10 years. Typically, you would say somebody who is chronically lonely is somebody who says, I'm lonely all the time, and I've been lonely for more than 2 years in that way. Okay, you'd maybe say that this is more chronic loneliness. And chronic loneliness is often related to things like abuse and trauma in early life, and personality traits like shyness, neuroticism, social withdrawal, things like that there, okay? State loneliness is different. State loneliness is where something happens in our lives and it causes us to feel lonely, okay? So another way of defining that is loneliness which is consequent to an occurrence, okay? Something has happened, we have become bereaved, and suddenly we now feel lonely as a result of that. So that is what state loneliness is. And a bit like the example that Eddie gave about his family member, I spoke to a woman a number of years ago, and she told me about the fact that she didn't often feel lonely, but most days she felt lonely between the hours of 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. So I said, well, why do you feel lonely between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m.? Well, it's because whenever my husband was alive, that's when I would have made the tea for him, and we'd have sat down together, and we'd have eaten together. And she said she still has that struggle between 5 and 7 p.m. The loneliness kicks in then because she thinks back to the relationship she had with her husband and being able to have that engaging time with him. And when 7 p.m. kicks, it goes because she then gets on with the rest of her evening, and she's able to manage that. So for many of the people that you might meet who say, well, I'm not really lonely, but I'm lonely every so often or occasionally, it may be something like that where it relates to a particular incident, like a bereavement, a particular time which is important to that individual that used to be shared with another person, okay? So those are the important things to sort of bear in mind about loneliness. Now, I want to talk briefly about some risk factors that are apparent with loneliness in older people. It might surprise you to learn that actually if we were to talk about loneliness throughout the life course, we oftentimes talk about loneliness in older people, don't we? We sort of link the two together. But studies actually consistently show that the loneliest life stage is adolescence, actually, okay? And then older age kind of comes after that, and I'll talk briefly about why that is in a moment. But adolescence kind of relates to that sense of social loneliness rather than the emotional loneliness that actually older people might feel, okay? So people who are older, again, as we've talked about this morning, bereavement is a key factor, being no longer married. So being divorced and separated is also associated with loneliness as well as bereavement. The older you get, so for example, if we were to say that people who are older start at 65, just, which is sometimes how it's defined, whether you agree with that or not, what we tend to find is that usually the loneliness begins to really identify itself in the over 80s in particular, okay? And that relates to things like limited mobility, driving cessation, feeling frail, being female, living alone. These sorts of factors come into play. But one other which I forgot to put up here and which is really important is no friends or having less access to friends. So sometimes we lose our friendship groups as we grow older because unfortunately they are contemporaries of ourselves, they were our peers, and they actually have started to die and become more immobile themselves, so we lose those. In fact, one of the pieces of research that was carried out by Engage with Age by Boyle in 2010 said that 43% of the respondents said that they had no contact with their friends, okay? And actually, one of the things that I'd like to highlight to you, which you may be surprised by or you may not be aware of, is that friendship is more likely to reduce loneliness than ongoing contact with family members, okay? Ongoing contact with family members is really important for things like social support and actually addressing things like social isolation. But actually addressing loneliness is not so well met by ongoing contact with other family members apart from a spouse, outside of a spouse. I did a piece of research a few years ago, and one of the surprising findings for me was that whenever I looked at all the older people who I talked to, the people who were reporting the greatest loneliness weren't the people who lived on their own. They kind of got the second highest. The people who reported the greatest loneliness were the adults who were living with their adult children, okay? And I think part of the reason was because it's actually not a chosen way of living by a lot of older people. There's something has happened to make the older person go and live with their adult child, or for the adult child to have stayed living with the older person, which actually gives a sense of loneliness or unfulfillment, okay? So it's quite important to bear that in mind. One of the things I just want to address in the next couple of slides is that we're talking a lot about loneliness, very important issue, and a lot of older people are affected by loneliness. But one of the things we must remember is that the majority of older people are not lonely. So we shouldn't make assumptions or presumptions about older people and perceptions that they might be lonely. And interestingly, what this graph shows us is that the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that older people are lonely. But actually, once you get to 65, you're much less likely to say, we think older people are lonely. Actually, I'm doing okay. I don't feel lonely. Okay yet. You know what? When I was 25, I thought I would be lonely. But actually, I'm not lonely, okay, once I get to 65. You can see the perceptions there. It looks like there's a slight rise around 55 to 64, maybe a little bit of anxiety kicking in there. Am I going to be lonely? And then actually, once you hit 65, actually, I'm not lonely. So that's fine. So a lot of older people aren't lonely. And again, this is a survey of a lot of different researchers and academics who've looked at loneliness. And you can see that actually, if we were to say how many older people are actually often or always lonely, it kind of works out around about 10%, okay? 1 in 10 actually feel often or always lonely. If you're to then include the people who are sometimes or moderately lonely, you'd probably get about 40%. But it means that there's about 60% of older people who are saying, I'm never lonely, or I'm very seldom lonely, okay? So again, I want to just sort of us to recognize loneliness is a really important issue, and for those 10% of people who experience loneliness, it can be very severe, it can be very troubling. But the good news is that a lot of older people don't feel lonely, okay? Just to come into some of the factors that have been relating to recent research within Northern Ireland and Belfast, one of the things that was found that in terms of a risk factor again for loneliness was that people who live in socially deprived areas and neighbourhoods in Belfast were actually at greater risk of social isolation. I think Greer's term was social isolation rather than loneliness. And so those factors are to do with the fact that actually poverty, impoverishment throughout the life course, unfortunately makes us more vulnerable to loneliness when we're older. There's something that academics call cumulative inequality. And that kind of means that if you start off, say, as a young person, even in the family that you're maybe born into, and you don't actually have an awful lot, most people unfortunately end up stuck in that kind of bracket where they don't have an awful lot throughout their lives. But if you come from a position where you have quite a lot of advantage, again, you have more and more advantage as life goes on. So unfortunately for older people who come from a more socially deprived area, they have less resources. They're more vulnerable to the things that Eddie was talking about in terms of poor health and different things like that. So that increases the risk to loneliness for individuals in maybe more socially deprived neighbourhoods. The one caveat I would say about this, and having been a community worker myself and worked in communities, is that oftentimes working class communities have an awful lot of strengths within them, and they are really good at actually looking after each other and promoting connectivity and connectedness within each other. And maybe Greer's report doesn't really demonstrate that. We've talked a bit about that already, about the health mobility. In Boyle's report, again, we found that 43% said that they had no contact with friends, and actually 40% reported also that they don't have enough friends and acquaintances. So again, there's that increased vulnerability to loneliness because of the lack of connection with other friends. Okay, just want to talk about gender for a few minutes, or a moment or two. So one of the things that we can see is that females are more likely to outlive males, and because of that, that increases their vulnerability to loneliness. Their greater longevity, unfortunately, makes them more vulnerable in that way. Being partners or surviving partners of a relationship, they're more likely to be the people who have the impact of bereavement forced upon them. They're more likely to be living with poorer levels of health, more likely to be living alone, more likely to have problems with mobility, okay? So women do have very significant problems in later life, more likely to be that 80-plus population who do need that extra support, that extra access. And historically in Northern Ireland, women have been less likely to have been car drivers than men. Now, that's probably changing now, but in the past that would have been the case for older people who are older now. They may have been less likely to have been car drivers, which again is something which is significant in loneliness, as we'll talk about in a moment. So for a lot of older women, we mustn't... there's been some really good points about the fact that actually we need to promote avenues for men and where they can make connections, valuable connections, meaningful connections, but we mustn't forget the support for women as well. One example that I'm sure most of you are aware of are things like men's sheds, which have been very popular over the last 10 to 15 years across the world, originated in Australia. Very interestingly, the guy who originated men's sheds said that men don't like to talk face to face. Men like to talk shoulder to shoulder. Okay? So in other words, what men actually like to have is some task that they can focus on. And whilst they're undertaking the task, they might actually open up a bit and engage with the person beside them about actually how they're getting on. Because if you want to ask a man, so are you feeling lonely today? Oh, no, I'm not feeling lonely. Oh, me? No. No, I'm a man. I do not feel lonely. Okay? So they're more reluctant to open up about loneliness. But whenever they're working together on a task, they begin to develop those relationships and friendships, and they can become meaningful. And one of the things that I do want to indicate, well, actually, I'll come on to that later, but in terms of our interventions about loneliness, they shouldn't necessarily be focused on loneliness per se. We should be thinking about something which actually brings people together, a focus that brings people together, but actually can then allow people to open up whilst they're in those places. Things like the pub actually still are viewed as very valuable informal spaces for men. Wherever they don't feel that they have to be doing a particular thing or gathered together for a particular reason. They like that informal social contact. Okay. So, the car. One of the difficulties for a lot of people in later life is that they actually begin to cease driving, or they feel they have to give up driving for a range of different reasons. They lose confidence in driving, or they're told actually that they can't drive anymore. And then for some people, and again we talked about for older women, they may not have driven at all. And in Northern Ireland, that can be a particular problem because we are a community that doesn't really use public transport an awful lot, or haven't done historically. There was one survey actually done that less than 5% of journeys undertaken by over 60s within Northern Ireland are on the public bus service, okay? So it kind of indicates how reliant we actually are on the car. I've actually been doing research recently with people in County Derry, Londonderry and County Tyrone living in rural areas and using community bus services. It's been really interesting to hear about that, but also about the difficulties and the regrets and the mourning of actually not being able to use a car anymore to get around and being able to do things for themselves. The car is great at giving independence and being the friend at the front door, which allows people to get out and about. And actually stopping driving has a real negative impact for individuals. So it's something that we need to bear in mind, and one of the things, especially maybe not so much for Belfast, but perhaps for rural communities within Northern Ireland, one of the things that we do need to think about is shoring up our community transport services and making sure that we keep using them and we keep allowing them to be accessible. And I know there's a high cost involved in that, but I think they're really important. And again, just to highlight this a little bit further, as you can see here, we have a comparison between two lots of people who continued to drive after 2002 and people who continued or who ceased driving in 2002. And there's a very marked decline, and the decline sort of becomes wider over time. So the longer that you've ceased driving, the more likely you are to actually have less social engagement than somebody who actually is driving. So it's a real risk factor, and one that we need to recognize and acknowledge. Okay, so what do we now do about loneliness? So some recommendations perhaps in terms of where we can go next. One of the things that is important, that our planning is person-centered. In other words, we're listening to the individual themselves and what they're telling us about what they think would be effective or what they think is valuable to them. Age UK have piloted a program over the last number of years in England, which is really centered around this idea of doing individual interviews with older people and then trying to then match them to a particular service, as opposed to saying, we're setting up this service, why don't you come along? Okay, which it may be effective for very many people, but actually starting with where the older people are at, where they're coming from, what they want to do. If you have the resources to do that, that would be fantastic. That's something that was recommended by Age UK, and I recognize it doesn't work for everyone, and it can be resource heavy to do that, okay? One of the things that I feel that we must be is being creative. So again, that point that I made earlier, one of the things that we don't want to do is create loneliness groups. So if I was to say to you, hi, I run a loneliness group, it's for lonely people, just like you, you're going to say, yeah, no thanks, mate, don't want to go to your loneliness group, okay? However, if you set up a group which is related to interests and things that people are really want to do, arts groups, whatever it happens to be, I've loved hearing these guys doing their readings this morning, things like, being able to get together to do readings, drama groups, things like that there. Those are the things which may then pull people in who actually are feeling lonely. But if you start off with this idea that we're going to create a loneliness group, you may be very disappointed by the uptake, okay, to that. One thing which is really important is about targeting existing networks, okay? Very interesting what Lorna said in terms of when she was looking at the hubs. She said that one thing which really helped people get into the hubs was the fact that they knew somebody already within the hub, okay? For older people, and maybe for all of us at whatever life stage we're at, wherever we're liking to go, we like to know there's somebody there that we know, and that makes us feel a bit more comfortable and more confident about what it is that we're going into. And again, the research will say that what older people want is not necessarily to be introduced to a load of new people. They don't mind that. But actually, what's more important is, can you sustain my existing social network, the people that I actually am friends with, or create ways where I can get to my friends that I already have? Because that would be really valuable to me, rather than meeting all these strangers. Now, they may become good friends over time, and in the hubs, I'm sure that was true, that by connecting, my friend's going, now I meet all these other people, fantastic, I've got all these new friendships, okay? But actually, being able to work with the existing networks of friends, families, neighbours is really important for a lot of older people. Developing interest groups. Groups generally have overall, there's quite a good evidence base for groups being effective in addressing loneliness for older people. One of the things that, Linda, you pointed out in the word cloud was that going out was a really important issue, and I thought I was so pleased to see that. I've been speaking to the older people who are using the community transport system. One thing that was coming up over and over and over again was, it gets me out of the house, gets me out of the house, gets me out of the house. A really important thing for older people. I don't want the person, well actually they don't mind the person coming to visit them in the house, they don't mind that at all, but they want to get out of the house as well. Okay, so it's important to be able to get out, to be able to go to venues, have activities, okay? And groups have a good, a relatively good evidence base in terms of that. Slightly better than befriending, but again, I don't want to put down befriending, and I hear that from Lorna's report again that befriending has been quite successful here, so that's a good thing. One of the difficulties with befriending is the next point, okay? And one of the risks with befriending is befriending might always be something which somebody does for the older person, okay? that can be a risk with befriending. And what that does is that means it sort of goes against a reciprocal kind of relationship. So a reciprocal relationship is where somebody has a sense of being able to do something. Again, there was a few things, came across in your word cloud, Linda. One of the things that was coming across, I want to help younger people. I want to help the family. I want to volunteer. I want to get involved. Now, that doesn't speak to me of let's have a service where the person sits passively and and we do something for them. We want services where the person can give something back to the person that they're with. So if you're doing befriending, the older person has to be able to give something to the befriender as well, for that to be especially meaningful for the older person. So that just to bear that in mind, folks, all right? The last point I've said is to keep talking, and what I mean by this is that who actually responds to older people's loneliness? Is it the community groups? And I think community groups are fantastic. As I say, I used to work in a community group a number of years ago. And community groups are fantastic what they do. But sometimes the policymakers are quite happy for voluntary groups to go off and do their thing. Oh, great, that doesn't cost us any money. And again, Eamon, you've talked about the fact that the amount of money that is saved by older people and the things that they actually do for the community. So one of the things that we need to be engaging with it is the policymakers and the people with the purse strings, just to make sure that we're getting the age-friendly cities that are being promised. You know, one of the things that they talk about in the age-friendly cities is making sure buses are accessible, pavements are easy to walk across, different things like that. These are really important issues to help older people get out and about. One of the older people I spoke to a number of years ago talked about the fact whenever she didn't like to use the public bus system. The reason is that, yes, it lowers down now to allow her to get onto the public bus, onto the bus. However, as soon as she gets on the bus, the driver closes the door, he's away. And she's sort of trying to get to her seat, okay? So that's a thing that is very off-putting for some older people, and something, again, could be very easily rectified, something like that, I would say. So just to bear that in mind. And that is all I have to say. So thank you very much, everyone.